All right, well, good morning. Glad to see everybody is recovering from their turkey comas all right, and those of us that went Black Friday shopping still have all of our limbs. So I'm glad we survived our Thanksgiving weekend, but in all seriousness, I hope you got to spend some time with family and friends and just enjoying some time off and being thankful and being grateful. I mentioned before, I'm a one holiday kind of person, so we can finally start to celebrate Christmas now that Thanksgiving's over. And I'm excited to kick off our Christmas series, Festival of the Light. It seems like Christmas, unlike most other holidays, everyone has their favorite pastime related to Christmas, right? A lot of people are like, my favorite is the food. Or some people, it's the gifts, or some people, it's about spending time with family. It just seems that Christmas tends to evoke some of that nostalgia more so than other holidays. And for me, Christmas was all about Christmas lights. I don't know how many of you guys feel like that, but I really loved to look at Christmas lights when I was younger. And even up through college, I was the one that decorated my parents' house with Christmas lights and that kind of thing. Now, around here, if you want to see Christmas lights, where do you go? Okay, the Speedway or McAdenville. Both of them are crazy. Like, you sit in line forever. But it's impressive what you can do with just a few lights and how that really transforms the darkness and the night around when they turn on. See, where I grew up, we went to a place called Western Carolina Center, which is up in Morganton. So it's a little bit different, but nonetheless, despite the distance, Christmas lights are sort of universal. I actually got to take my daughter, we went out and visited my parents this week, and got to take her to see Christmas lights for the first time. So she was trying to climb out the window of the truck to get to the Christmas lights, but she definitely enjoyed them. And that sort of really resonated with me because there's something inherent about light. Everybody loves and feels comfortable in light. It's just a universal. It doesn't matter your upbringing. It doesn't matter your faith or your background or any different variable. Light is universal. I think that's why we see so many tree lighting ceremonies and why all of our towns decorate their light poles with different lights and that kind of thing. There's just something welcoming about it. Doesn't matter who you happen to be. I think that's, even though that tradition is related somewhat in Hinduism and it's rooted in that, which I think Pastor Brandon's going to talk about in a few weeks, it's just universal. There are things we just relate light to. Good. Right, if you're a Star Wars nerd, you're thinking, yep, light side versus dark side, right? There's just this intrinsic idea that light is helpful, light is safe, and so on. But have you ever stopped to consider the question, what if light didn't exist? I'm willing to bet none of us stop to think about that because, especially in America, light is so abundant. You flip a switch and it's always there. But when we travel to Haiti, we like to joke that we think the entire country's on one 15-amp breaker because at random points, man, it's like they flip the one light switch and the whole country goes dark. And it really makes you stop and think, what if light was never around? So I'm going to do something a little bit different. But I'm the student pastor, so I get to get away with doing things a little different. And I had 100% participation in this in first service, so you guys got a high bar to meet. I want everybody to close your eyes as tight as possible. Go ahead, nothing strange is going to happen, nothing awkward, nothing weird. It doesn't necessarily give you a full picture, but that's kind of like what it would be if light didn't exist. And so we start in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Keep your eyes closed. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness is over the face of the deep. Pitch black, nothing but God. And he begins to create, and it says, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. Okay, you can open your eyes. That was a little awkward, wasn't it? A little uncomfortable to sit there. I mean, you didn't know, Mondo, you could have opened your eyes and I could have been standing right in front of you, right? There was some awkwardness there. So there's a familiarity, there's a comfortable nature that comes with light. And it all started all the way back in creation. The very first thing God creates, he says, let there be light. And then he says, and the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning on the first day. So, light, God's first creation that he claims is good, it sort of starts this whole connection that light is a good thing, light is a helpful thing, and ultimately light is connected with God himself. And that brings us to our first point this morning, this creation event, and that's declaration of the light. Right? God stated, God declared, and then there was light. The very first act of all of history, the very first recorded piece of literature is concerning the creation of light. Right? A holy and perfect God, the first thing he does is make light. This is like I said, this is how we connect sort of subconsciously, light with good things and light with God himself. But I think we need to clarify our understanding of light just a little bit, because the way that we use light and we understand light in our world today is light causes darkness to recede. And when I mean recede, as long as the light is on, darkness is sort of pushed back. But the light can be turned off and then darkness can return. That's recession. It's a temporary thing. I don't know how many of you have been to my house. Some of you have been. It can be midnight at my house and I can make it look like it's noon outside. I just have a lot of lights on the outside of my house. Some of them motion, some of them not. In fact, if you walk out my front porch, it'll be pitch black, and before you're off the first step, you can see my whole sidewalk all the way in front of my house. It has pushed the darkness back, but ultimately those lights will time out and the darkness will return. That's recession. However, when the Bible talks about light and darkness, light permanently removes darkness. It's a very different understanding. Once light comes in, light does not turn off. It doesn't go away and allow the darkness to return. Light is a permanent thing. And that's why it's connected with God himself. So it's a removal of darkness. And I think what's important here is that God isn't just, he's not saying, okay, now the sun exists so you can see. That's a benefit of it, for sure. But what God is really doing is he is declaring permanent intention. God says, I'm going to permanently remove the darkness that blinds you. So from the very point of creation, God is using light to declare his ultimate intention. That darkness would be permanently removed, not just from our physical world, but ultimately from the spiritual world. That he intends to annihilate spiritual darkness permanently. Light is a representation for God's holy, good, and perfect design for all of his creation. And so this intimate connection here between light and between God, I think, is what drives the strong preference in each of us toward light as well. I think it's innately wired in because light is in a very close relationship and has a strong connection with the Trinity. And that association, it brings us to our second point this morning, and that's the distinction of the light. How many of you guys watched sports this weekend? All right, so there's either you're riding or, yeah, okay. So I don't get to watch a lot of sports, but every once in a while I'll catch a football game or a basketball game. And I notice this more often in basketball games, especially the NBA, than any other sport. But how many of you guys, you take a notice and you see all these rich people and these celebrities sitting courtside, right? And then it never fails. There's always this one guy. You're like, who in the world is this guy, right? He's sitting courtside, but you don't know him. You've never seen him before. He's in jeans and a t-shirt. Definitely doesn't look like he fits there. The question's always the same. How did that guy get that seat? Well, ultimately, it had nothing to do with that guy. Maybe he's friends with somebody that plays for the team, or maybe he knows somebody who is wealthy. That guy got that seat because of his relationship with somebody else. He was associated with somebody who gave him that position of prominence. It's the same thing with light. Light is significant not in and of itself, but because of its association directly to God. We need to understand that light inherently doesn't do anything. But it is used figuratively and metaphorically often throughout biblical record. Right? It represents God's operation, God's intervention. It represents God's providence, God's blessings. So because of its consistent relationship, that's why light is distinct. That's why it's important, right? Whether in the form of a column of fire leading people out of Egypt, or in a giant blinding flash on the road to Damascus, or ultimately in a return from the east in Revelation, light is consistently important because it's consistently revealing the work of God to an otherwise blind humanity. It represents His favor and His love and His guidance. You can read Amos 5:18 and it shows you the opposite, that darkness represents either God's judgment or sin, if you want a reference for that to look up later. But I think most importantly for us this morning is that light, as you read and it develops, and especially you get into the New Testament, light represents both God's love and ultimately His salvation. So we're going to start and we're going to read John 1:1. And I want to make some pretty big theological connections in this passage that are really going to set up the rest of this series all the way up through our Christmas Eve service. And so it starts and it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Okay, don't miss the fact that Word is capitalized. Word is a noun here. So it's a person, a place, or a thing. That's the first thing I need you to notice. And it said, He was in the beginning with God. So now we know that Word is a person because we have the pronoun He. So in the beginning was the Word. So He was in the beginning. And all things were made through Him, and without Him not anything made that was made. So you've got the Word, who is a person who's at the start of creation through which light was created. Then it says, "And in Him was life, and the life was light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." So what we have is a very strong connection here between God, the Word, and light. Now, when it's referencing the Word, it's referencing Jesus Christ. So what we have is a connection here between creation and Jesus as the light. See, when Jesus said, I'm the light of the world, He wasn't just arbitrarily pulling a statement out of thin air. He was going all the way back to creation and connecting and saying, hey, from the very beginning of time, I was there and this was the plan, and I am it. See, John has crammed a lot in just these few verses. So the light comes from the Word, and the Word is Jesus. That's sort of a summary of the first part of that. And then it says that Jesus, who is the Word that created that light, that light provides life for everyone. It's the entirety of God's plan for humanity summed up in 4 verses. You have light through Jesus that provides life for everyone. It pushes back the darkness of sin. And so when Jesus comes to earth at Christmas, what you have is a physical manifestation of light, because Jesus is the spearhead of God's love breaking into a world that is darkened by sin and enslaved in that darkness. So Jesus is light, and through those, we see the light of God come to a world that is lost and broken in sin. All the way back to creation, that connects. And you can trace it through. I think there's probably people who spend a lot more time studying this theme of light that can sum it up a lot better. And so just studying through that, one of them said, through the Word of God, light came into existence. And then through the revelation of God in Jesus Christ, that Word brought light to humanity. The distinction of that light is Jesus Christ and the salvation of mankind that He brought with Him. Jesus brings light, which brings salvation to the world. And that brings us to our final point this morning, direction of the light. I know that's a lot of theological conversation sort of dumped on you at one time. And it probably leaves us asking the question, what does that all mean? What it reveals is from the very beginning of time, light was and is still traveling in a specific direction to a specific place. It's not random. It has a point. It has a plan. And that's where it's headed. And that direction, I think there's 3 different directions that sort of go together. But the first of those is that the light is going and headed for every person's heart to bring every individual into a personal relationship with God Himself. That's one part of the direction of the life, that we encounter Jesus Christ amid our own darkness on a very personal and spiritual level. It's like Jesus is the lighthouse in the middle of a dark, stormy ocean. And we each get those opportunities to encounter that. But I also think that all of history can be said to be pointing in the direction of the light. And people struggle with this a little bit because they talk about all the bad things that happen. But the Bible is very clear. Even when nothing else will shout and acknowledge God, the rocks in creation will. So no matter how dark things look, the light is always continuing in the direction it was planned. God's plan is always unfolding. It's always working out, right? I mean, it all points to Him, and you can pick the darkest moments in all of biblical history. Israel's been captive for hundreds of years in Egypt, and yet what does God use to lead them out? A pillar of light, a pillar of fire. You can see prophecy about Jesus regarding the light and regarding His coming all the way up through the New Testament, where you see Jesus' arrival, even up to today, where Paul refers to us in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 5, as children of the light. The light can never be diminished. It can never be put out. It can never be snuffed out. That's what the end of that passage in John was saying. The darkness has not and will not overcome the light. It all points to God and salvation. You know, Mark even talks about Jesus' death on the cross and what we know as the Easter time frame. It tells us that as Jesus passes from the world on the cross, that everything goes dark. It says, and when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. The light had arrived at its temporary destination. Its purpose on earth was being fulfilled. And for some reason, I don't recall ever picking up on this, but there was a 3-hour period of darkness. That's incredible foreshadowing for a 3-day period in which Jesus would be in the grave and then return. Right? The light was gone for 3 hours and then it was back. Jesus was gone for 3 days. And then light burst out of the tomb brighter than it ever was before. Doesn't matter how dark things look, the plan of the light is always moving forward. I mean, after all, we talk about this at Easter, but without Christmas, there is no Easter. And how did God announce at Christmas? What did He use? He used a star so bright it couldn't be ignored. right? They showed up to shepherds in a field, and it was so bright they couldn't stand to look at it. They were so afraid of how bright the lights were. The light made things noticeably different to people who were paying attention. And each of us now, the church, we're called to reflect that light into the darkening of our world. Now, I'm afraid that when you hear me say church, you hear me say New Life. And that's true. As an organization, we are called to do that. But remember, when the Bible references church, he's talking about you, not this organization. Each of us individually are called to reflect the light that is coming into a darkening world. Now, I hear so many people complain about how bad things are getting around us, but I don't see anybody going in and doing any spiritual intervention about it. I don't see anybody willing to reflect the light into the darkest places. And I wonder if it's because in order to reflect that light, we must first be receiving that light. And some of us, or a lot of us, we seem to struggle with hearing. Right? That's what people always say. We hear a lot is, well, I'm not hearing from God. I don't know what God wants me to do. God's not speaking in my life. And I'm not saying that's never true, that you don't feel that way. But what I go back to is the fact that there is a strong connection biblically between Jesus and God and the light and the Word. I find most of the time we struggle to reflect the light because we're not listening, not that God's not speaking. The light is always there. We just aren't tapping into the source as often. Just like on that first Christmas where God spoke through the manifestation of His Word in His Son Jesus, He's still providing direction and light through that same Word. Psalm 119, 105 tells us, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and it's a light unto my path." So the light works for salvation in us, and then the light works through us as long as we're tapped into the source for our own growth in order for us to then shine the light out into the world. If you're looking for the light this morning, if you're saying, hey, I have been saved, I know that relationship, but I'm struggling to hear from God, and subsequently I'm struggling to reflect anything that resembles Him out into the world, I might suggest that you would spend time with the Word that actually speaks about the light, with the Word that is the light. And so as we conclude this morning, I just have a few different things I want to do. Firstly, I just want to point out that God loves you enough to shine a light into the darkness of sin and slavery that you are currently in. He loved you enough to die on a cross while you were still His enemy, while there was nothing in you but darkness. Because ultimately, you are His image bearer. You are designed to reflect His light. And if you've never entered into that relationship, I'm going to give you that opportunity in just a moment. But for those of us who have entered into that relationship, and maybe what we're reflecting would be more characterized by darkness than light, perhaps it's time that we shine that light back into the dark and uncomfortable areas and recommit to that relationship this morning. We have no problem celebrating everything Christmas is about except for what Christmas is truly about. Because while, yes, Christmas was about a baby being born, Christmas was ultimately about our salvation and our Lord coming to do something we never could for ourselves. So that brings me to your challenge this morning to go home this week. You know, Elizabeth, our Kids Life Director, and myself, we spend a lot of time talking about different themes throughout the year and things we see our students and our kids struggling with. And it's alarming to me how many of our kids, or us, alarming to us, how many of our kids and our students do not know the real meaning of Christmas. Listen, we see 100+ kids come through a week, and most of them think Christmas is about Santa Claus and presents. We have made this mistake where we assume because our kids are with us in a Christmas service that the church will teach them what they need to know. That is false. We have allowed our homes to be driven by consumerism instead of God. So your challenge this week is to go home, and I don't care if your kids are 25. If they're in your house, sit them down and go through the Christmas story. Read what Christmas story is all about. See, I was fortunate growing up. Every Christmas Eve, for as long as I can remember, my grandfather would sit down all 14 of his grandkids, and we would read the Christmas story every year. He made it a point that we would do that before we opened any presents, because it spoke volumes to us about what was important and what was primary and what was first. Now, the second part of that challenge, I want you to do that I want you to read that same story before your family opens gifts on Christmas or Christmas Eve or whenever your family opens gifts. Make that a tradition. Because until we understand what actually happened and who actually came and what was put into motion on Christmas morning, we'll never understand and appreciate salvation. We will never get it. And what we'll end up with is a generation who doesn't understand and know who Jesus Christ is. So that's your challenge this morning.